Chapter 1. The inheritance nobody talks about. There are two kinds of inheritance. The first kind is obvious. It shows up in a will, real estate, a business, a portfolio, money that moves from one generation to the next in a legal document, witnessed and signed. The second kind is invisible. It doesn't show up anywhere official. Nobody writes it down. No lawyer handles it. But it's the one that actually determines whether the first kind survives. It's a way of thinking, and in the families that have been wealthy for 100 years, not the ones who got rich and lost it, but the ones who built it and kept it. This invisible inheritance is passed down with the same care and intention as any financial asset. More, actually. Most of us never receive it. Not because we weren't wealthy enough, because nobody in our family had it to give. And that's what this video is really about. Before we go any further, this is for educational purposes only. Nothing here is financial advice. Apply your own judgment. Chapter 2. The room where it starts. Imagine two children both around 12 years old. The first child grows up in a comfortable home. Money isn't discussed. When things are tight, the stress is palpable but unspoken. When things are good, the spending reflects it. New phones, new clothes, a nicer holiday. The message absorbed, without anyone saying it directly, is that money exists to be used when you have it and worried about when you don't. The second child also grows up in a comfortable home, but in this house, money is a subject. At dinner, there are conversations about why the family made a particular financial decision. At 15, she sits in on a meeting with a financial advisor, not because she's expected to understand everything, but because she's expected to start. At 17, she's responsible for managing a small portion of her own money and explaining her decisions to her parents. By the time both of them are 25, they have the same university degree. Roughly similar incomes, completely different relationships with money. The first person treats a salary hike as permission to upgrade their lifestyle. The second person treats it as an opportunity to increase their investment rate. The first person experiences financial anxiety as a background noise that never quite goes away. The second person makes financial decisions with a quietness that other people find difficult to explain. Here's the thing about that quietness. It wasn't a personality trait. It wasn't intelligence or discipline in the conventional sense. It was learned. Inside the family, over years, through the slow accumulation of conversations and small responsibilities, and the consistent message that money is not a reward for the present. It is a resource to be managed for the future. The wealthiest families in the world don't produce financially capable children by accident. They produce them by treating financial education as the most serious thing the family does. Not school, not extracurriculars. This, because they understand something most families never learn. The money can survive almost anything except an heir who was never taught how to think about it. Chapter 3. What Instagram did to your net worth. In 2012, Instagram had 30 million users. By 2024, that number was over 2 billion. That shift didn't just change how people shared photos. It fundamentally restructured the psychology of consumption. And the financial damage is enormous, largely invisible, and almost entirely unexamined. Here's what happened. Before social media, the comparison set for most people was local. Your neighbors, your colleagues, the people you actually knew. And while keeping up with the Joneses was already a documented financial hazard, the Joneses were at least somewhat calibrated to your actual economic reality. They lived near you. They earned roughly what you earned. The gap between what you had and what they had was real and limited. Social media blew that comparison set open. Now, your reference point is not your neighbor. It is a curated global feed of people showing you their best moments. The Dubai trip, the business class upgrade, the luxury car parked at the right angle for the light, the new iPhone within days of launch, the "I invested in crypto at the right time" post that never comes with a follow-up. You are not comparing yourself to people who live like you. You are comparing yourself to the highlight reel of millions of people across every income level, selected by an algorithm specifically optimized to make you feel like you are behind. The psychological mechanism this triggers has a name in behavioral economics: social proof. The implicit belief that if enough people around you are living a certain way, that is the normal to aspire to. And when the people around you expands to include every aspirational lifestyle on Earth, the cost of feeling normal quietly becomes astronomical. This is not a coincidence. The entire architecture of modern consumer culture, the EMI that makes the car feel affordable, the buy now, pay later that makes the phone feel free, the travel credit card that makes Dubai feel like it cost nothing, is engineered to convert the psychological pressure of social comparison into purchase decisions. The pressure is manufactured, the credit is provided, the consumption follows. Old money families are almost entirely insulated from this, not because they are morally superior or immune to human psychology, because they have a competing framework that is stronger than the social comparison instinct. The framework says, visible wealth is not wealth. It is the performance of wealth. And performance costs money. Every rupee spent on the performance is a rupee that is no longer working. There is a family somewhere, old money, 3 generations deep, whose children do not post their holidays. Not because they don't travel, because they were raised with the quiet, bone-deep understanding that broadcasting your financial position is not just tasteless, it is expensive. It invites comparison, pressure, social extraction, and the slow ratcheting up of your own expectations about what normal life should look like. The goal of financial privacy, in the old money world, has always been this: protect the asset from the psychology that destroys it. In 2026, that psychology has a 2 billion user delivery mechanism running on your phone, and it is very, very good at its job. Chapter 4. The Seduction of the Upgrade. Let's talk about something specific. You've been using the same phone for 2 years. It works. Everything on it functions. Nothing is broken. But the new model just came out, and the reviews are incredible, and your friend has one, and there's a no-cost EMI option that breaks it down to something that feels negligible per month. So you upgrade. This is not a catastrophic decision. Nobody is suggesting that upgrading your phone is the reason people stay poor. But this decision, and specifically the psychology behind it, is worth understanding very carefully, because it doesn't stop at the phone. The same logic that justifies the phone justifies the car on EMI, when you could have bought something functional for less. It justifies the Dubai trip on a credit card when you told yourself you'd pay it back in 2 months. It justifies moving to a more expensive apartment when the raise comes through because you can afford it now. It justifies the lifestyle that, looked at clearly, grows almost perfectly in lockstep with the income, consuming every rupee of new earning before it has a chance to compound. This is lifestyle inflation, and it is the single most efficient mechanism ever designed for the destruction of middle-class wealth. Here is what makes it genuinely insidious. Lifestyle inflation never feels like a financial mistake. It feels like progress. It feels like the reward you've been working toward. Every upgrade is individually justifiable. The phone was old, the apartment is closer to work, the car is safer, the holiday was necessary, you were burned out. None of the individual decisions seem wrong. What you don't see, because the human brain is not wired to see it, is the aggregate. Every lifestyle upgrade you make resets your baseline, and once a lifestyle resets, it almost never resets downward. Psychologists call this the hedonic treadmill. You adapt to each new level of comfort so completely that it no longer feels like a luxury. It feels like a necessity, and the next upgrade becomes the new thing you're reaching for. The families that have preserved wealth across generations broke this loop by treating it as a structural threat, not a personal virtue challenge. They didn't rely on willpower. They built systems, clear rules about what percentage of income is never available for lifestyle, investment allocations that happen automatically before discretionary spending is even possible, a family culture where upgrading your visible life at the expense of your invisible asset base is understood as the mistake it is. The math, when you run it honestly, is confronting. A family that earns well but upgrades their lifestyle with every raise may spend 30 years looking prosperous, but the assets underneath the lifestyle will be thin because the compounding was interrupted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently, year after year. Every time the income went up and the lifestyle went up with it. The family that earns the same amount but keeps the lifestyle flat or grows it slowly and intentionally, always behind the income curve, builds something that most people only see the surface of. The asset base underneath grows quietly, invisibly, for decades. And then one day the grandchildren inherit something that looks, from the outside, like old money. It wasn't old money, it was deferred upgrades. At scale, over time. Chapter 5. The year everyone became an investor. 2021 was a strange year for money. Crypto was going vertical. NFTs were selling for prices that made no rational sense. Meme stocks were moving on Reddit posts. A coin named after a dog created real millionaires. Everyone suddenly was an investor. Everyone had a portfolio. Everyone knew someone who had made 6 figures on something in the previous 3 months. The FOMO was deafening. It wasn't just greed, though there was plenty of that. It was something deeper. A social pressure so intense that people who had never invested in anything found themselves putting savings into assets they couldn't explain because the alternative, sitting out while everyone around them apparently got rich, felt psychologically unbearable. Then 2022 arrived. The same logic that drove the AI stock frenzy of 2023 and 2024 drives every speculative cycle. Something new appears. Early participants make extraordinary returns. The story spreads. Social media amplifies it beyond its actual scale. The FOMO psychology activates. The fear of missing out is, neurologically, almost identical to the fear of loss, and it overrides rational analysis with remarkable ease. Capital floods in from people who don't understand what they're buying and don't particularly need to because the price is still going up. And then it isn't. The exits belong to the people who understood the asset. The losses belong to the people who understood the social pressure. Old money families watch speculative cycles with an expression that is difficult to describe. It's not contempt. It's more like recognition. They have seen this before. Their grandparents saw a version of it. Their parents saw a version of it. The assets change. The psychology doesn't. Their portfolios are famously boring. Index funds, quality real estate, businesses with long operating histories that generate real cash. Nothing exciting. Nothing that would generate a single engaging social media post. No 10-bagger story to tell at dinner. What they have instead is something that doesn't make good content. Consistency. Decades of uninterrupted compounding at the boring market average, year after year, while everyone around them cycles through enthusiasm and regret on the speculative carousel. The S&P 500 has returned roughly 10% annually over the long run. That number sounds modest. Run it across 60 years with no interruption, and it doesn't sound modest anymore. It sounds like a dynasty. The dynasty is built on refusing to be interesting. Chapter 6. The thing debt actually costs you. Most people understand that debt has interest. Few people understand what that interest actually costs. Here's the calculation. Almost nobody runs. You're carrying a credit card balance, say 40,000 rupees, at an annualized rate that, for consumer credit in India in 2026, runs between 36 and 42% on many cards. Let's call it 36 for the calculation. The monthly interest alone on that balance is roughly 1,200 rupees every month, for as long as the balance exists. Now here's the part that changes how you see it. That 1,200 rupees, if it were invested instead at a modest 8% annual return, becomes something very different over 25 years. Not a massive amount, but enough that you would feel it, enough that your children would feel it. But it's not being invested. It's being paid as rent on money you already spent. Consumer debt doesn't just cost money, it costs future wealth. Every month you carry a balance. You're not just paying interest, you are permanently converting what could have been a compounding asset into a fee charged by someone else for the use of capital you consumed. Old money families have an almost visceral cultural aversion to this, not because they are frugal by temperament, because they understand compounding well enough to see debt as its direct inverse. Compounding grows wealth automatically over time. Consumer debt shrinks it automatically over time. Both are invisible, both are exponential, both operate without any drama. The difference is which direction they're running. The old money rule on debt is essentially this: never borrow for something that is losing value. Leverage, if it's used at all, goes toward assets that generate returns above the cost of borrowing. A business, productive real estate, capital with a working function. Consumer debt, the car, the phone, the holiday, the wardrobe, is simply not a category that exists in the framework. Not because those things aren't enjoyable, because the invisible cost of borrowing for them is a price that a steward of long-term capital refuses to pay. Chapter 7. What the third generation never learned. There is a pattern so consistent across cultures and centuries that it has earned its own proverb in nearly every major language. In English, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. In Mandarin, there is a version. In Japanese, in Arabic, in Hindi, every culture that has observed wealth long enough has noticed the same thing. It rarely survives the grandchildren. The numbers behind this are staggering. Studies tracking wealthy families across decades have found that most significant family wealth is gone by the second generation. By the third, the rate approaches 90%. 90%. For every 100 families that successfully build real wealth, 90 of them will have nothing to show for it by the time the great-grandchildren are adults. This is not a story about taxes or inflation or bad luck. It's a story about what happens when money moves from one generation to the next without the thinking that created it. The first generation knows exactly how fragile money is. They felt it. They built from nothing, or close to nothing, and they understand at a cellular level what it took. They save instinctively. They are cautious about debt because they remember what it felt like not to have any cushion. They live carefully not because someone told them to, but because the memory of scarcity is still alive in them. Their children grow up watching this. They inherit some of the habits, soften some of the edges. They spend a little more freely because they can. They still have some of the muscle memory. Their children, the third generation, grow up inside the wealth entirely. They have no reference point for what it costs to build. The money has simply always been there. It is, to them, as permanent and unremarkable as the furniture. They spend it because that is what money is for in the world they grew up in. They don't feel reckless. They feel normal. And by the time they reach middle age, the fortune that took a lifetime to build has been distributed across a decade of lifestyle. The families that break this cycle, the rare 10%, don't do it by being genetically superior. They do it by treating the transmission of the mindset as non-negotiable, not just the assets, the understanding, the conversations at dinner, the meetings with advisors that start at 15, the small responsibility that comes before the large inheritance, the family culture that makes financial stewardship feel like identity, not obligation. Wealth plus worldview survives. Wealth without worldview doesn't. This is the only generational pattern that actually matters. Chapter 8. How to become the first generation. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Every family that is now old money was once somebody's fresh start. The family that has preserved wealth for 100 years started somewhere. One person, at some point, made a decision to relate to money differently than the culture around them was telling them to. They saved when they could spend. They invested when they could upgrade. They taught their children when they could have stayed silent. And the decades did the rest. You don't need a family trust to start this. You don't need a high income or a financial advisor or a head start of any kind. What you need is a framework applied to whatever you currently have, compounding over whatever time you're willing to give it. Practically, this is what it looks like. You stop treating money as something that flows through your life and start treating it as something you are responsible for protecting. That is not a budgeting technique. It is a psychological shift, and it changes every financial decision that follows. You build a system, not a plan. Plans fail when motivation drops. Systems run automatically. Investment contributions that leave your account before you can touch them. A ceiling on lifestyle that you raise slowly, deliberately, never in lockstep with income. A rule about consumer debt that you apply without deliberation, every time, because rules don't require willpower in the moment. You extend your time horizon, not to next year, not to retirement, to your grandchildren. When you ask, should I buy this? The better question is, what does this decision compound into? Not every purchase needs to pass that test, but running it seriously, even once a week, changes the texture of how you relate to spending. You stop performing wealth before you have it. The Instagram post, the visible upgrade, the status signal, these feel like celebration, but they are actually expensive advertisements for a lifestyle you may not be able to sustain. The families that kept wealth didn't broadcast it. They protected it by keeping it invisible. And you start talking about money inside your family, openly, seriously, without shame, and without drama. If you have children, they should understand, at whatever age is appropriate, where the family's money comes from and what the family is trying to build. Not as a burden, as an identity, as the kind of family you are. This is how it starts. Not with a windfall or a lucky investment, with a decision about what kind of thinking you're going to bring to whatever money passes through your life. 90% of family wealth disappears by the third generation. The 10% that doesn't isn't luckier. It isn't smarter in the conventional sense. It's simply decided at some point to be the kind of family that treats money as something to protect rather than something to spend. You can make that decision tonight with your next paycheck, your next raise, your next financial moment, however small. You don't inherit old money. You become the first generation of it.